November 1965, the Central Highlands of Vietnam. 400 and 50 American soldiers were dropped into a small clearing near the Chu Pong Mountain. They thought they were landing near the enemy. They weren't. They had landed directly on top of a North Vietnamese base, outnumbered, surrounded, and cut off from any escape. What happened next should have been an American massacre, but instead it became one of the most studied battles in military history. This is the story of Landing Zone X-Ray and why the line refused to break. For decades, the Ia Drang Valley has been a name spoken in hushed tones among veterans. To the average person, it's just a coordinate on a map. But for those who study the art of war, it represents a terrifying shift in history. It was the first time the United States Army would face the North Vietnamese regulars head-on. No more shadows. No more hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. This was a full-scale conventional collision, and it happened in a place that looked like hell on earth. The morning of November 14th began with a deceptive calm. The soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, were being ferried in by Huey helicopters. The slick pilots, as they were called, were the lifeblood of this operation. Inside those choppers, young men sat shoulder to shoulder, gripping their M16 rifles. At that time, the M16 was a new, controversial weapon. Some soldiers trusted it. Others feared it would jam at the worst possible moment. They were about to find out the truth in the most brutal way imaginable. Very few people know how thin the margin of survival really was. As Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore stepped off the first helicopter, his boots sank into the tall elephant grass. He looked toward the dense tree line of Chu Pong Mountain. It was quiet. Too quiet. At 10:48 a.m., the silence didn't just break, it shattered. The North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, had been watching every single landing from prepared positions on the mountain slopes. They had a clear view of the clearing. They waited until the Americans were at their most vulnerable, spread out and trying to establish a perimeter. Then, the mountain erupted. The air was suddenly filled with the rhythmic thumping of AK-47s and the terrifying whistle of mortar rounds. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a coordinated, high-intensity assault by over 2,000 disciplined soldiers against less than 500 Americans. The weight of those numbers is hard to visualize until you are standing in the middle of it. They were everywhere, survivors would later recall. They were coming out of the trees, out of the ground, out of the grass, but the nightmare was just beginning. In the chaos of the initial contact, one group, the 2nd Platoon of B Company, spotted a small group of NVA and did what they were trained to do. They pursued. They pushed deep into the thick scrub, moving away from the main landing zone. Within minutes, they realized they had been baited. The North Vietnamese closed the circle behind them. 29 American soldiers were now completely cut off from their battalion. They were alone in the dark heart of the jungle, surrounded by hundreds of enemy troops who wanted them dead. This group would go down in history as the Lost Platoon. For the next 2 days, these men would engage in a private, desperate war for survival. They dug in with their bare hands and helmets, forming a tiny circle of resistance. Every time the grass moved, they fired. They were running out of water. They were running out of hope. Back at Landing Zone X-Ray, Hal Moore was fighting a battle on 3 fronts. He had to keep the landing zone open for supplies. He had to defend the perimeter, and he had to find a way to save his lost men. The North Vietnamese tactics were brilliant and terrifying. They used what they called hugging tactics. By staying within 30 yards of the American lines, they rendered the U.S. artillery almost useless. If the Americans called in a strike, they risked killing their own brothers. This forced the battle into a primitive, visceral state. It was a fight of bayonets, entrenching tools, and point-blank gunfire. You could hear the enemy shouting orders. You could smell the cordite and the iron scent of blood. There were moments when the NVA was so close that American soldiers could see the expressions on their faces. This should have never happened, one officer later remarked, but it was happening. And the line was beginning to bend. By the afternoon of the second day, the situation reached a breaking point. The North Vietnamese had launched a massive human wave assault on the southern side of the perimeter. The American foxholes were being overrun. It was at this moment that the radio crackled with a message that would change the course of the war. Broken arrow. This was the ultimate distress signal. It meant an American unit was being annihilated. When those words were broadcast, every American aircraft in the sky over South Vietnam dropped what they were doing and headed for the Ia Drang Valley. Suddenly, the sky was filled with A-1 Sky Raiders, Heft 100 Super Sabres, and massive bombers. They began a relentless carpet bombing campaign just yards away from the American positions. The earth didn't just shake, it roared. Napalm, a terrifying jellied gasoline, splashed across the jungle, turning the green canopy into a wall of orange flame. The heat was so intense, it singed the eyebrows of the Americans in their foxholes. But even this wall of fire didn't stop the NVA. This leads to one of the most unexplained aspects of the battle. Despite the thousands of tons of explosives being dropped on their heads, the North Vietnamese kept reappearing. How? The official military reports speak of tunnels, but those who were there suspect something more complex. The NVA had turned the entire mountain of Chu Pong into a subterranean fortress. They weren't just hiding in holes. They were living inside the mountain. They could move entire companies under the feet of the Americans without ever being seen. Imagine the psychological toll on a 20-year-old soldier from the Midwest. You fire your weapon into a bush, you see the enemy fall, and 5 minutes later another soldier emerges from that same bush. It felt like fighting a mountain that was alive. As night fell on the second day, the jungle became a theater of ghosts. The Americans used flares to illuminate the battlefield. For a few seconds, the world would be bathed in a harsh, flickering white light. In those seconds, you would see hundreds of figures charging toward you. Then the flare would go out, and you were left in total darkness, listening to the sound of footsteps in the leaves. The men didn't sleep. They couldn't. If you closed your eyes, you might never open them again. On the third morning, the sun rose over a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. The lush jungle was gone, replaced by blackened stumps and scorched earth. The North Vietnamese finally began to withdraw. They had tested the Americans, and they had seen the power of the air cavalry. They realized that they couldn't win a conventional war against this kind of firepower, so they would spend the next decade perfecting the art of the ambush. When the relief forces finally reached the lost platoon, they found a miracle. Out of the 29 men who had been cut off, several were still alive, still clutching their weapons, still guarding their fallen comrades. They had held the line when everyone else thought they were gone. Hal Moore was the last man to step onto the helicopter to leave the valley. He had kept his promise. He was the first on the ground and the last to leave. But as the Hueys lifted off, looking down at the scarred earth of X-ray, there was no sense of triumph. Only a heavy, somber realization. The Battle of Ia Drang was a victory on paper, but it was a warning in reality. It showed that the North Vietnamese were willing to die in staggering numbers to protect their land. It showed that the aircav concept worked, but at a cost that was almost too high to bear. 79 Americans died at Landing Zone X-ray. Over 600 North Vietnamese soldiers were confirmed killed, though the real number is likely in the thousands. So why does this story still matter today? It matters because it reminds us of the reality of sacrifice. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a game. It was 450 men in a hole in the ground, refusing to let the person next to them down. Was this a brilliant tactical success? Or was it a tragic intelligence failure that cost too many lives? And what really happened in those tunnels beneath the mountain, tunnels that many veterans believe are still there, hidden under the vines of the Central Highlands? The ghosts of X-ray still have stories to tell. We just have to be willing to listen. What do you think? Was the broken arrow call a stroke of genius or a desperate move that almost backfired? Leave a comment below. We respect the history of those who served, and your voice helps keep that history alive. If you want to hear more classified stories and military mysteries that the history books tend to skip over, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. The truth is often buried deep. We're here to dig it up. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious,